Now, on the morning of the murders, Mr. and Mrs. Borden had their final meal here in the dining room. They were here with John Morse. Uncle John had arrived on Wednesday afternoon. He was the brother of Sarah Borden, Mr. Borden's first wife. He and Andrew had remained friends since Sarah's death, and he was from Hastings, Iowa. And he had arrived actually a few weeks before, and he was staying with a friend in Swansea. But he arrives on Wednesday afternoon. On the doorstep, Mrs. Borden invites him in. He had some things to do around town. She said, "Well, you're staying with us for the evening." So she set him up in the guest bedroom, where her body was found the next day. But the morning of the murders, it was Mr. and Mrs. Borden, John Morse, and Bridget Sullivan was here. She was the Borden's maid. She had been with them for 3 years. Lizzie did not join the family for breakfast. She no longer took meals with the family, and I'll tell you why when we get into another room there. And Lizzie's older sister Emma was away in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, visiting the Brownell family, and she had been out of town for the last 2 weeks. Now, a couple of days leading up to the murders, the entire family had been sick, and it disturbed Mrs. Borden so much so that she felt the family was being poisoned because they had been so violently ill the night before. And she went over across the street to see Dr. Bowen to voice her fears to him, and he calmed her and said it's probably just the food going off in the heat. Breakfast that morning was 5-day-old mutton broth. Didn't have a nice chest, made a big pot of it, stayed on the stove. Reheat it, stays on the stove, reheat it. So they were probably suffering from a little food poisoning. Breakfast also consisted of some sugar cookies, fresh fruit, bananas, some pears, and coffee, and Johnny cakes. Don't forget the Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes are small cornmeal pancakes. They can survive the Holocaust. So they're pretty indestructible. John Morse left the house first that morning to attend to some of his business, and Mr. Borden followed him out soon after, and I'll tell you about Mr. Borden's walk when we get into the sitting room there. But right now I'm going to tell you about the autopsies. Mr. Borden's body was, of course, found in the sitting room. Mrs. Borden's body was upstairs. When she was discovered, she was brought down here to the dining room. The dining room table was covered with a sheet. Mrs. Borden's body was placed on top of it. Mr. Borden's remained in the sitting room where he was found, laid out on a undertaker's board, much like this one on the wall here.
Someone had asked that earlier, like, what that is hanging up on the wall.
I love that thing. The stomachs were removed. Dr. Bowen, of course, was the first doctor on the scene. But the stomachs were removed. After the examinations were completed, both bodies were laid side by side on the dining room table and covered with a sheet to await the caskets. Saturday morning, the double funeral was held in the sitting room. The sofa had been removed from the house as evidence. It was an open casket. Apparently, Undertaker Winwood did such an amazing job that they could leave it open for Emma to come in and give him Lizzie to come in and give him a final kiss. And they placed his head in such a position that he would never have known it, apparently. I don't know how the hell they did that with but they did it. Only a few people, close friends and relatives, were allowed into the house for the funeral. The family sat in the front parlor, greeting their guests. When the caskets left, they say over 2,000 followed them to Oak Grove Cemetery. The streets were lined to watch the procession go up the road. Lizzie and Emma did not get out of the carriage. Only Uncle John stood by the graves. Now, while the family was out, the police came in and did another search for the house. And that's when they found the handleless hatchet in the basement and took it into evidence. Now, I'll send them this way. Sorry for the condition of the pictures, but my better ones took a walk somewhere. This is a photograph of Mrs. Borden's head, and this is Mr. Borden in the sitting room. The bodies were not buried right away after the family left the grave site. They were removed from the graves and taken to a receiving vault. With a few days later, they're given another examination by order of the mayor. Now, it's at this time that the heads of the bodies, the heads are removed from the bodies. The heads are sent up to Harvard Medical School, where they're examined again by Dr. Dolan and his assistant. They report their findings to Jose Knowlton, the prosecutor. And Dr. Dolan takes the heads home with him, where he boiled them in his basement. And where every good autopsy photo should be is, of course, in the dining cabinet. Mr. Borden is on the left, Mrs. Borden is on the right. Mr. Borden received 10 to 11 blows directly to his face. Mrs. Borden received 19. So if you want to kind of come around this way and have a look in the cabinet, and I will meet you in the sitting room. And I'll go to get out of the room.
It's the closest I've ever seen, like, feels like a zombie.